The medical examiner. Dark shift at the morgue. The clock struck 10 p.m. when Dr. Eleanor Vance walked through the frigid corridors of St. Jude Hospital in Boston. The morgue, located in the hospital's basement, was a labyrinth of concrete, exposed pipes, and steel doors. The smell of formaldehyde and disinfectant permeated the air, mingling with the sweet odor of death that never completely dissipated. Eleanor was an experienced medical examiner known for her coolness and precision, but that night the cold seemed more intense and the silence heavier. In the autopsy room, 2 gurneys occupied the center. On one, the body of a 19-year-old young man, pale skin and an expression frozen by the final spasm. On the other, that of a young woman, perhaps 25 or 26 years old, dark hair spread over the sheet. Dr. Richard Davies, her colleague on duty, received an urgent call. His wife was unwell. He apologized, promised to return soon, and left in a hurry, leaving Eleanor alone with the dead and the distant hum of the ventilation system. She began her work as she always did: gloves, scalpel, automatic movements. The young man's body was opened, examined, stitched. Then the woman. Eleanor avoided looking at the charts until the end, preferring to focus on the physical details, on the silent signs each body carried. She closed the woman's chest, washed her hands, and went to the small break area to grab a cookie. As she turned, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The woman's gurney was empty. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, held her breath. The body reappeared, motionless as if it had never left. "It's the sleep," she murmured, trying to convince herself. She returned to work, but the feeling of being watched did not leave her. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the woman's head slowly turn towards her. The scalpel fell from her hand. Eleanor approached, adjusted the corpse's head, certain it was just her imagination. But the cold intensified, and with each exhale, a small cloud of vapor escaped her mouth. The thermostat showed 72 degrees Fahrenheit, but Eleanor felt the biting cold of an endless winter. She decided to check the hallway. Empty, dark, absolute silence. As she closed the mirrored glass door, she almost dropped the scalpel again. The reflection showed the gurney empty. She spun around. Nothing. The woman's body had vanished again. She looked on the floor, under the tables, behind the curtains. Nothing. Panic began to creep in. Eleanor tried to rationalize, attributing everything to fatigue, isolation, the constant tension of night work. But looking again at the reflection in the door, she saw the woman standing beside her. Her hair fell over her face, her chest open, revealing ribs, organs dangling like rotten fruit. Eleanor spun, but found only emptiness. The doctor felt her legs weaken. She sent a message to Richard, trying to describe what was happening. No response. She decided to leave the room, but the door was locked. She was certain she hadn't locked it. The feeling of entrapment, of being caught in a nightmare, took over. The cold intensified, and the lights began to flicker. Suddenly, the woman's body appeared beside her, eyes open, dull, but fixed on her. Eleanor fell to her knees, screaming, her hands covering her face. The lights went out, plunging everything into darkness. The silence was broken only by Eleanor's own screams, echoing off the tiled walls. When the lights came back on, the body was back on the gurney, perfectly untouched. The sheet covered the stitched chest. The arms rested beside the body, the face serene. Eleanor, still kneeling, tried to catch her breath. She felt drained, as if part of her vital energy had been sucked out by the cold, by the invisible presence that hovered in the room. Minutes later, Richard entered, startled by his colleague's state. "Eleanor, what happened? Don't tell me you can't be alone in the morgue," he scoffed, trying to ease the tension. Eleanor grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "Never leave me alone here again, Richard. That deceased woman almost gave me a heart attack." Richard laughed, but the laughter died when he looked at the gurney. "Which deceased woman? Eleanor, we only received the young man's body today. There's no woman's body here." Eleanor insisted, describing the woman in detail. The procedure, the cold, the disappearance. Richard consulted the charts. Only the young man was registered for that night. Doubt set in. Eleanor was not the type to make up stories. She was methodical, rational, incapable of confusing hallucination with reality. The fear, however, was real. And from that night on, she was never again left alone in the morgue. The following days were restless. Eleanor tried to convince herself that it had all been a breakdown, a result of accumulated stress. But small signs began to appear. Objects moved. Instruments disappeared and reappeared in unlikely positions. The cold, always the cold, seemed to follow her, even on the warmest days. Richard, skeptical, began to notice the changes. One night, while reviewing reports, he heard footsteps coming from the hallway. He stood up, but found no one. He returned to the room, and the scalpel he was using had vanished. He searched everywhere until he found it, clean on the empty gurney. Eleanor observed everything in silence, fear growing with each new, inexplicable event. The morgue became a hostile place where time seemed to distort. Sometimes Eleanor felt that she wasn't alone, even when no one else was around. The sound of breathing, whispers, the icy touch of invisible hands on her neck. She began to record everything in a notebook, trying to find a pattern in the events. But the only pattern was fear. One night, a body arrived at the morgue, a woman, victim of a car accident. Eleanor hesitated before starting the autopsy. The cold was more intense than ever. Richard stayed by her side, trying to reassure her. "It's just a body, Eleanor. There's nothing here but us two." But during the procedure, the light flickered and went out for a few seconds. When it came back on, the body was face down, although both were certain they had left it on its back. Eleanor's scalpel had vanished again, and an icy handprint appeared on her forearm. Richard, pale, admitted that something was wrong. From that day on, the two began to work together on all night shifts. Fear was shared, but it was also a bond. They began researching reports from other medical examiners, seeking explanations for what they were experiencing. They discovered that St. Jude's morgue had a history of strange events, unexplained deaths, and employees who requested transfers after episodes of terror. The manifestations intensified. Voices whispered names. Instruments fell on their own. Doors slammed without wind. One night, while reviewing reports, they heard a low laugh, coming from the hallway. Richard, armed with a flashlight, went to investigate. He found the morgue door open, although both were certain it had been locked. That same night, Eleanor dreamed of the woman from the first night. In the dream, she was standing beside the gurney, her chest open, her eyes fixed on Eleanor. "You saw me," the woman whispered. "Now I see you." Eleanor woke up screaming, the cold ingrained in her bones. Richard, increasingly shaken, suggested asking for a transfer. But Eleanor refused. She felt she needed to discover the truth, that there was something unresolved in that morgue. She began to investigate old records, looking for information about violent deaths, disappearances, anything that could explain the manifestations. The research revealed a disturbing pattern. Several young women had died under mysterious circumstances at the hospital over the decades. Some were never identified, others had their bodies lost, swapped, or cremated without family consent. Eleanor began to suspect that the morgue was a meeting point for restless souls trapped between the world of the living and the dead. One night, while reviewing old reports, Eleanor felt a presence behind her. She slowly turned and saw, reflected in the cabinet glass, the woman from the first night. Her eyes were empty, but fixed on Eleanor. "Help me," the apparition whispered. Eleanor, overcome by a courage she didn't know she possessed, asked what she wanted. "My name," the woman replied. "Give me my name." Eleanor spent the night searching through files, trying to identify the woman. She found a nameless file, only the physical description and the date of death, November 13th, 1982. The body had disappeared from the morgue that night, never to be found again. Determined to help, Eleanor began searching for information on missing persons from that period. She discovered that on the night of November 13th, 1982, a young woman named Margaret O'Connell had disappeared after leaving work. Her body was never found, and the case remained unsolved. Eleanor contacted the police, providing the information she had discovered. Days later, she received confirmation. The DNA from the nameless body matched Margaret's. The case was reopened, and the family was finally able to bury their daughter with dignity. The next night, Eleanor returned to the morgue. The cold was less intense, the silence less oppressive. For the first time in months, she felt at peace. But she knew that the morgue still held many secrets, many restless souls. Section 9. Richard, now less skeptical, began to respect the morgue's silence. Together, they created protection rituals, prayers, candles, small offerings discreetly left in corners of the room. The environment became less hostile, but respect for the unknown remained. Eleanor continued to record the events, transforming her notebook into a haunting diary. She discovered that by giving names and dignity to the dead, the manifestations decreased. The morgue was not just a place of death, but also of passage, of redemption. St. Jude Hospital gained a reputation for being haunted, but also for respecting the dead like few others. Eleanor became a reference, sought out by colleagues from other hospitals to share her experience. Fear gave way to respect, and terror to compassion. Today, Eleanor still works in the morgue at St. Jude. The cold remains. Shadows still dance on the walls, but she no longer fears the unknown. She has learned that death is not the end, but a transition, and that the dead also need care, respect, and sometimes a name. The medical examiner's account is a dark reminder that there are secrets only the night reveals, and that not all science can explain what lies between life and death. For Eleanor, every shift is a vigil, an act of courage and compassion in the face of the inexplicable.